Stephen Friedman has the, I think, very daunting task in only 10 minutes to respond. Thank you.
Look, before I actually address the papers, there's something I'm going to steal a minute or two to do something which I hope somebody's done before I got here, but if somebody hasn't done it before I got here, I want to do it. And that is to say that we lost a giant yesterday. Neville Alexander, who passed away yesterday, was a great South African. I find it very difficult to talk about him without getting emotional. Simply to say that Neville was a socialist intellectual who believed passionately in equality. He believed in social change. But Neville was also the kind of human being who never showed any disrespect ever to opposing positions. He loved debate. He loved argument. And he was often far more respectful to people who disagreed with his point of view than many people in this country who claim to be liberal Democrats. Neville didn't believe in democracy, he lived democracy. And I hope that the kind of discussions we're having today can be in some small measure a tribute to his memory. So having discharged that obligation, let me turn to these three papers, all of whom I think are very rich and very provocative. And as the chair says, I can't possibly be expected to deal with all of them. But just to set a stage here, make two broad observations. The one is that I happened to be in a discussion a couple of weeks after the events of Tahrir Square began to attract people's attention with a group of colleagues from around the world who are all students of democracy. And I was virtually thrown out of the room at that stage for warning my colleagues that tragically in many cases and sadly in many cases, the struggle for democracy is not a short process. It is not, democracy is, if to the extent that it is won at all, and in my view, democracy is never fully won because democracy is always something we aspire to, and democratization is what we do to try to get a little bit closer to that. But I try to warn them from my own experience in South Africa and from the experience of every other social process which led to some form of democracy that I'm aware of, that the process is always difficult, the process is always longer than we hope, and the process always depends on organization, and on the ability to maintain that organization over long periods. Now, I think that all three papers in different ways have confirmed that prognosis. And I think that that's a very important corrective to some of the rather naive views which were expressed at the time in which the so-called Arab Spring began. Secondly, I want to take slight issue, but only slight issue with Larbi Sadiki's representation of democracy as the representation of difference. I would argue that democracy is best understood as the institutional expression of the principle that every human being is entitled to an equal say in the choices which affect her. And in that sense, the representation of democracy is a very important, representation of difference is a very important part of the story, because every human being who happens to differ from the mainstream is entitled to that equal voice. On the other hand, democracy is also about power, and democracy is also about the redistribution of power. But on the question of representation of difference, let me pick up for a second on something both Juan Cole and Phyllis Bennis dealt with. Which is quite clearly to reiterate the point that if people in democracies choose to vote for parties which have religious affiliations, that is a very important democratic right, and it doesn't to any extent vitiate a democracy if they do so. That said, I am extremely concerned about the growth of religious fundamentalism. I think it's a major problem in Alabama, Mississippi, and in various other parts of the United States. And I think that the United States and other countries which claim to support democracy should really take a much firmer view on the religious fundamentalists in the Middle East who've been occupying power in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv since 1948. So it does seem that religious fundamentalism is a democratic right if you're our religious fundamentalist, but not if you're the other guy's religious fundamentalists. I think that the kind of issues which Larbi Sadiki raised are obviously very important issues, and I must confess to being a political theory nut, and if you gave me 40 minutes or 50 minutes to engage with his paper, I would run out of time. I think he's raised some very important issues, and I think that part of the issue that he's one of the many issues he's raised, and I certainly do agree fundamentally. I think that's implicit in what I said about the engagement I had with my colleagues on Tahrir Square, that his point that we're only in the question asking stage at the moment rather than the trying to answer stage, I think is a very important point. And I think that some of the things that he's asking us to ask questions about, or the way in which I read both his presentation and the summary of the written paper, is that we need to ask questions about the extent to which traditional forms of power tend to reassert themselves in democratization processes. This is a problem everywhere. It will no doubt be a problem in the Middle East and North Africa area. I think that it's very important for us to take cultural traditions seriously. I think it's very important for us to take cultural specificity seriously. But I do warn, and I don't think that's what he was arguing for. I do warn, however, against what I would call a new Orientalism. And the new Orientalism is the essentialization of those kind of cultural differences. It tells us that configurations of power, because that's very often what we're talking about when we talk about cultural specificity, that configurations of power which have been there for a long time are necessarily destined to be there forever. That is obviously not necessarily the case. In my own work on Africa, I've engaged quite a bit with the work of, for example, some Norwegian sociologists who've proved entirely to their own satisfaction that Africans have no cultural interest in democracy. If you actually read their work, it shows very clearly that Norwegian sociologists have a very poor understanding and very little interest in democracy. But it does show quite clearly that the African people whose views that they're interpreting are actually quite enthusiastic Democrats. And I suspect that if one did similar work, and probably similar work has been done in the Middle East, North African region, you would find exactly the same phenomenon, that the so-called Arab or Orientalist rejection of democracy is a cultural fiction. But the question I was left asking about from Sadiki's paper is, or from his presentation, is when we talk about the remaking of democracy, who is we? I think the who is we point is very important. I'll deal with Juan Cole's point in a moment, but I think one doesn't have to go into some sort of rigid class analysis in order to say that democracy is ultimately about redistributing power, and we need to take a broader view of power. Cultural power is important, symbolic power is important, but it is about redistributing power, and therefore it's important in any democratic moment or any potential democratic moment to ask who is trying to remake the society, who is opposing that, and what the balance of forces is, because it's only in that way that we get a sense of what the limits and the possibilities are. There was some German fellow who made a point sometime in the future about human beings remaking history, but not in circumstances of their own choosing, and that's a very important analytical tool to work out what can be changed and what can't be changed. And that's why I found Juan Cole's presentation so interesting, because it did deal with precisely those issues. But I do want to issue a bit of a corrective, and it's a general corrective to the way in which we see the events in the Middle East and North Africa. One of the themes of listening to all three papers is the extent to which many of the issues which the presenters raised as specific to the Middle East, North Africa region were in fact very familiar from our own history. And in Juan Cole's presentation, he talked about the role of students or scholars and organized workers. Same thing here in South Africa. Those were the people who led the fight against apartheid in South Africa. The troubling question that we need to ask is, nobody would look at South Africa 18 years after democracy was achieved and say this is a society in which the dominant social forces are young people and organized workers. The obvious point being that the question of who makes the revolution, if we want to use those terms, is an entirely different question from the question of who has the organized power to appropriate the change. And I think that sort of analysis, and I think it is too early, but I think that kind of analysis is very important. The other point I wanted to make from Phyllis Bennis's paper is I'm doing some work at the moment. I'm writing a book on a piece of South African intellectual history. And this question of the use of arms and the effect that it has on a transition is central to the kind of debates that happened here. And I think the perspective I would offer on that is to say those of us, and I happen to be one, those of us who devoutly wish that arms were never used in these processes, have to accept that we very often lose the argument and that there are various very important realities which occur, whatever we argue. But where I would, and that's certainly the case in our experience, where I would agree with her analysis entirely, is that the evidence is overwhelming that societies in which change is achieved by force have very different problems and often quite far more intractable problems than those in which it is not. And I think South Africans, for example, very often underestimate the extent to which even the limited, and it was limited, the limited guerrilla conflict in this country has had consequences and social consequences which we're not quite coming to terms with. I think there are two other points in Juan Cole's presentation, which I just wanted to refer to briefly. The one is just a passing comment. I gather it's come up here, but it's a bugbear of some of us. The great Twitter question. None of us who have a problem with the suggestion that the revolutions are made by Twitter and Facebook, none of us are denying your obvious point that these communication technologies are helpful when people organize. What we are saying, however, is that they are no substitute for organization. And the rather naive and quite frankly silly views on this process, which assume that all you need is a cell phone and a Twitter connection and you can change power relations, is not only silly but is actually quite unhelpful for those of us who actually care about democracy. I think I'm very interested in Juan Cole's discussion of what he calls the Schumpeterian process. I think some of us would want to take issue with that and to say, look, the idea that parliamentary democracy is some kind of Schumpeterian monopoly is something that really needs to be challenged. Schumpeter believed that democracy was about electing elites and then getting out of the way while they took the decision. I don't think that that's an indictment of parliamentary democracy. I think it's a very serious indictment of Schumpeter, but I don't think it's an indictment of parliamentary democracy. The challenge in any and that's the case in old democracies as well as new democracies. The challenge is not whether we have parliament or not. The challenge is how do we make parliament actually work as an effective democratic institution. And hopefully people in the Middle East and the North Africa region will have interesting contributions to make to that. So I think I've dealt with about all I can do in this space, but just to say finally, it does seem to me that as important, and it is, as important as the cultural dimensions are, as important as the ethical dimensions are, and they are vital, we do need to understand democratization processes as lengthy processes in which power is distributed from small elites to hopefully wider sections of society. The question I think we need to be asking as events in the Middle East and North Africa begin to unfold is who is challenging the existing power relations, who is defending the existing power relations, and what kind of alliances and conflicts are emerging, which can tell us whether the promise which began in some of the streets and marketplaces of Tunisia and Egypt is going to lead to a more thoroughgoing democratization. My own view, based simply on my understanding of our situation and some of the comparisons, is that we are looking in the Middle East, North Africa region at a fairly lengthy process, probably going over the next decade, 2 decades, in which the battle between the old forces of power and those who challenge them will be played out, and hopefully the kind of ideas we're being presented in this session and this conference will better help us to understand the directions in which they may develop. Thank you.
My name is Fawaz Tilo. I'm from Syria. Uh, I want to argue about what the Phyllis was saying. We have been arguing about that since yesterday, but maybe it's better that we argue today. There is something I will not argue about it. Maybe in the session in the afternoon, I will have the chance to give my opinion for not wasting your time by doubling my statements. But I will take some points. It's about what have been saying about what happened here is about the equalness between the two sides in Syria. It's like what we have been hearing from United Nations. She's talking, Mrs. Phyllis, about the two sides. The Syrian people is being killed without defining who is killing whom. The two sides is fighting together without saying that the other side, the revolutionists, after 6 months when they start to use weapons, to have their own very simple rights to defend their self, their women, their children to be slaughtered, like which have happened now. Before that, we have been, by the way, a rates of 20 to 30 persons is being killed every day from these peaceful demonstrations. Now we have 200 or 250, something like that. The people are still being killed. So it's not equal to say that those people have the equal responsibility of what's happened. There is a people defending themselves. This is very important. I remember while all the time the Israeli, when they start to their wars and civilians being killed, they were always, and the international community with them, blame the Palestinian. Why? Because he said these rebels is just hiding between the civilians, so they are responsible for the losing of their life. This is exactly what we are hearing now from the Syrian, from the Iranian, and from some people who support that this regime. So. Even when she's talk about the interfering of the international community, I think this is unequal. Look, I will tell you some secrets maybe, as I am politicians and I know what's happening behind the closed doors. Ms. Clinton have been announced for $12 million a donation for the Syrian, and she ate another $12 million. I will assure you that this 25 million, the most of it is still in the safe of the American. And this small amount which has been spent to us, it's not to send us an arms. It has been spent for a very small amount of medical equipment and transmission equipment. By the way, this transmission equipment is a way of spying of what people is doing on the ground. While the American was fighting, I mean that, the Qatari and Saudi and Turkey for not allowing for one bullet to be passed to us, and they are still fighting till this moment. So no, this is not equal. The Russian, the Iranian is fully support the regime with everything, while the other side is fully supporting us with a lot of statements here or there from time to time, but not a real support. I think.
Could I just interrupt? I'm just very sorry. You see, Phyllis will respond to you. I think you've really made the point. And after lunch, on the discussion of Syria, we'll really have more time. So we'll have time for you then. Could you accept that?
Yes,
please.
Yes,
thanks so much.
Different issues actually in my.
Okay, but can I give you just a very short?
One last statement. Almost all the whole Syrian people who support the revolution, who is out of 80% of the Syrian people, and with the vast majority of the Arabs, see the Libyan example is a successful example. So I don't know who we have to trust, the Libyan people and the Syrian people, or to trust some politicians or some academics here or there. Thank you.
Thank you. What I would like to ask is, in our search for the kinds of questions that we need to ask, what are your views on reflecting on shifts in worldview and the possibility of an emerging worldview? And with that I mean a shift away from a dualistic perspective on how things work, where end goals and the future provides meaning, and a linear view of time. In other words, hierarchy matters and end goals give meaning, versus a worldview where we, and some of the speakers have mentioned this, where we value or where we recognize the interconnectivity between everything, and therefore the time view is no longer linear but cyclical, and therefore there is meaning in the present texture of life. And what potential role could that play in what we see happening?
Thanks to the speakers for their wonderful input. I just want to commend, I think, Larbi for, I'm not sure that I'm interpreting properly, but I think to try and reframe the debate on democracy in some way. We seem to use Western scholars as reference points for understanding democracy, whether it's Weber or Hegel, Marx. Obviously, lots of writings have gone on these individuals, and lots of people have expounded on their ideas. But I think when he starts speaking about Ibn Khaldun and other scholars from North Africa, I'm encouraged by the fact that we're trying to look at democracy in somewhat different ways. So far, in many of the discussions I've come across, these are the names I've just mentioned are the reference points for democracy, as if democracy is understood by these people. And in more recent times, Huntington and I think this morning we heard about Perry Anderson, etc., etc. But I'm glad to hear that there are other scholars whose writings are now being reflected upon in terms of understanding democracy. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Riaz Diop from Siatini. I just want to say that the smart power of Obama versus the dumb power of Bush, along with the likes of the work of Juan Cole and Gilbert Ashkar, really split the left around the intervention in Libya. And the dialectic that was set up there was this, the ideas were essentially about uniqueness and necessity, and essentially grounded in the responsibility to protect. Whereas on the other hand, if we go historically, the ideas of self-determination, right, and non-intervention were marginalized, as Ambassador Dumisani Kumalo did excellently on the Burma issue when it came to the UN Security Council, saying we're not giving responsibility to protect traction in the United Nations Security Council. Why? Because it's the very definition of a democratic state that is at stake, and the Chapter 7 of the UN is not implicated in human rights violations at that level. So it was an issue of precedent, and I don't know why DERCO or Foreign Affairs didn't do a media strategy on that. But it's essentially the dialectic of self-determination, and Mamdani makes the point that neo-humanitarian interventionists, this Obama smart power, treat recipients of these rights, Libyans, as recipients of humanitarian rights rather than the full rights of citizenship. And this is a real problem, because when we look at the material aspects are that neoliberalism rules, whether it's South Africa, whether it's Libya, and in Libya they're just sending the check for all the destruction back to the people and they must pay. So this materiality of the economic conditions of, is it we're helping the Libyan people and, they can determine who's going to get the oil contracts and who not. And this split on the left, unfortunately, the dialectic, the Ashkars and the Coles setup works too well. Necessity and uniqueness do not make good analogies for theorizing how to deal with Bahrain. And this is actually a dumbing down of the debate. Ashkar gives a three-prong analysis for why violence was necessary. I just want to come back to the point of Sadiki about bringing ethics back into it. It's very good. Nietzsche said God is dead. But what he really meant was, God is dead, but the people who profess these ethics have hidden the body. So you can still go to church, and practice the rituals. And Islam also has that. Ibn Arabi said, the God you worship is under my feet. And he was referring to gold. So ethics are important. Religion is the opiate of the people, but like the Pan-Africanists or the Africanists in the Charterist debate in Africa, Pan-Africanists faced a higher standard of proof, as compared to Charterists, right, historically. And Muslims in a time of Islamophobia face a higher standard of proof. When we look at historically, the issue is, it was not democracy that led to good productive structure. It was not democracy that led to good productive structure in the Western countries. It was essentially changes in productive structure led to democracy. Yet we have this myth that you bring democracy, productive structure will change. Of course, China is changing all that, but we really need to get back to basics of how this worked in the Western world. And about this, is Islam compatible with democracy and all that is really nonsense. Why should we as the third world give the monopoly of definition to Marx or Weber or everything? There are two Hegels. The Prussian Hegel may have said all philosophy is Western, right? But, Hegel was also confounded by the Haitian Revolution. Right? I mean, there are two Hegels. There's a third world Hegel, and we need to rediscover this. But it's unacceptable, even implicitly, for Muslims to have a higher standard of proof when it comes to debating issues of freedom, justice, and ethics.
Thank you very much. I think it says not out of the blue. And these events happen because, let's look at the bread riots in Egypt, the textile protests in Egypt, the event in Tunisia, I think, was a trigger, but the signs were already there. Unemployed youth, underemployed youth in all of these countries in North Africa. And the lack of dignity and the robbing of dignity by Gaddafi of his own people. Having said that, have we reflected upon how we're actually going to address those issues and how those issues is going to impact on South Africa and other areas? We've actually rendered unemployment now systemic throughout the world. Occupy London, Occupy Wall Street, occupy Johannesburg one of these days, possibly. But I think the issue is, can they address the issues in Egypt of underemployment, of unemployment? Can they do so in Tunisia? Libya may have the resources to do so, but do they have the will to do so? And I think we need to reflect upon those kind of things in the resolution of the problems that gave rise to these uprisings. Thank you.
My name is Betsy Smith from Dirko. I've just spent 4.5 years in Israel. And I'd like to share something I read in one of the commentaries in, I think it was Haaretz, where one of the commentators said that the thing that some of the Western powers, including Israel, fear the most is the authenticity of the revolutions in the Middle East. That it came from the bottom, ostensibly without leaders, but it was not it could not be manipulated by outside powers, including the United States in Egypt. What makes it different is in Syria is that there's a mix between an authentic uprising within Syria and perhaps a more manipulated train of events outside. It reminded me of something I read a few months ago when Clemenceau and Lloyd George met in preparation for the Congress of Versailles after the First World War, when Lloyd George asked Clemenceau, so what are we going to talk about? Or Clemenceau asked Lloyd George, and he said, Palestine and Mesopotamia. And Clemenceau said, so what do you want? And Lloyd George said, I want Mesopotamia and Palestine. He said, you will have it. And he said something more. And Lloyd George said, yes, I want Mosul, because just prior to that they had discovered oil. And Clemenceau said, you will get it. Of course, they both went away, Clemenceau regretting the fact that he was so generous, and Lloyd George regretting the fact that he hadn't asked for more. Which brings me to the point now, in your academic studies, do you factor in the sustainability of the authenticity of these revolutions? I believe it's quite important. Also in the South African context, our own revolution, I believe, was authentic. But how do you support authenticity amongst those people in the Middle East without causing it to become inauthentic once again? Because even your best intentions can contaminate it. So I hope that you will reflect on that, and I'd be happy to hear what you say about that. Just a last question. Do you think that there are the stirrings of an authentic revolution within Israel amongst the Arabs there, given the situation that they are beginning to experience with discriminatory legislation, and how does that link with the occupation, with the Palestinians under occupation? Thank you.
Thanks so much. We get the panelists to deal with the 6 questions. Phyllis, first question from there on the Syrian issue.
Okay, well, there were actually a couple of different questions that included the question of Syria. Responding first to Fawaz Tello, I am not at all saying, and I don't think I said earlier, that that there is equal responsibility for the deaths of civilians. Clearly, the regime is responsible for vastly more than the opposition is responsible for. I still don't believe that further militarization is going to help the situation, for the reasons that I said. The legitimate, indigenous, authentic Syrian opposition movements do and will have no control over what kind of military intervention is involved, who uses it, what kind of military they attack. And I would just refer to a quote from one of the Syrian opposition members who went to Moscow on that delegation, Michel Kilo, who said, "If this destruction goes on and the ruling regime wins, it will rule over ruin and thus suffer a strategic defeat. If the opposition wins, it will inherit the country in an unimaginable condition. In any case, it is necessary to stop this violence, stop this bloodshed." From the international side, I think that has to be our major role. I'm not trying to talk on behalf of Syrians or Libyans. The trial balloons that have been sent up recently about whether the regime might be willing to negotiate the resignation of Assad in the context of negotiations rather than as a precondition to negotiations. Whether those trial balloons are real, I have no way of knowing. But it's that kind of negotiated process that is going to be involved in ending this conflict at some point. The question is, do we begin it now, or do we call for more militarization, further escalation of the civil war, because this is a full-scale civil war, not with equal sides, but nonetheless it is a civil war. I think it would be better to do it earlier rather than later. And then finally, on this question of authenticity, I agree that it is very, very important, and it's what links the uprisings across the region, from Syria to Tunisia to Bahrain to Yemen to Egypt to whoever I'm forgetting. You know, this is what is so vital. What we also have to recognize, though, is that there are consequences that are not under the control of those authentic forces. And I think that's what we're already seeing in Syria. We certainly saw it in Libya. We're seeing it now in the consequences of the Libya revolt. We're seeing it more in Mali than anywhere else in a more immediate way, from the over-arming of that whole region by outside powers who are not concerned with the legitimacy of regimes. Just finally, in answer to that last question about self-determination, self-determination is a complicated concept because it isn't governments that hold self-determination. It's people who have the right of self-determination. Governments don't have rights. They only have obligations. People have rights. And that distinction is a very hard one. The big problem for the United Nations has always been the contradiction between the UN Charter's emphasis on national sovereignty held by states and governments versus, not just with, but versus human rights as determined in the the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's that contradiction that the responsibility to protect notion flies up against. And it's why it's so complicated. So I don't have time to go further, but I think that the question of authenticity is central to these uprisings, but outside forces have taken on a huge role within them, not because they were invited in by the indigenous forces, but because they are opportunists looking for power.
Thanks so much. Stephen has accepted to answer the second question on the Kairos issue. Thank you. There we are, Stephen.
Okay, I just first of all wanted to tell Mohammed Dango he's worried about an Occupy Johannesburg movement. The problem in Johannesburg's always been occupied. We're trying to end the occupation, and we've got a long way to go. Sorry, you visited Johannesburg, I can tell from the applause. The question about, is this a new vision, I think is a very important one, because, and it relates to some of the points Larbi Sadiki raised in his paper. I think that we very often, when moments like these happen, and we should do this, it's important, we get excited and we say, there's a new imagining, there's a new vision. And there always is, because this is the nature of these kind of events. People are challenging the way in which their society has been ordered. They're looking for new ways of doing things. What we have to do, quite frankly, is to be realistic. And I think we need to have a realistic sense of how change occurs, whether it's intellectual or spiritual change or political change. And one of the mistakes very often, people who wanted change made was to assume that it all happens in this big bang and people have this new imagining and then it happens. It always happens incrementally. It always happens slowly. It always happens over a period of time. And I think the questions we ought to be asking about the particular societies we're talking about now is not whether there is some entirely new vision of the world, but are there new visions and new ideas emerging, and what prospect do some of those new ideas and new imaginings have of taking root in the period ahead? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's what we ought to ask. And that takes me to the other thing I want to respond to, which was Betsy's point. Betsy, I don't know who decides what an authentic revolution is. And I'd go a bit further and say I think Juan Cole's quite right. I think the discussion about whether something is a revolution or not is not a particularly interesting discussion, because what is the question we should be asking? To get back to the point I made to Ms. Mombach, it's about redistributing power in a wide sense, not simply brute power, but cultural power, symbolic power. And the question we always need to be asking, whether it's here or in the Middle East or in occupied Palestine, is power being distributed? Now, I think the preliminary sense in the Middle East, North Africa region is that clearly it is being redistributed, but it'll take us quite a while to find out in what ways it's being redistributed, how deep going that is, and how lasting it is.
Juan Cole, who wants to deal with the Libyan issue.
Well, I spent the last part of May and early June in Libya. I just want to make a few remarks about the aftermath of the revolution there. And I think there's no doubt that it was a revolution, however you would like to define the word. First of all, there's a black legend about Libya in the press, which I don't entirely understand. It is not a militia-ridden society. I went all around Benghazi, Tripoli, Misrata. I never saw militiamen. I don't deny they're there. They're there in the neighborhoods. They're young men with arms and so forth. But it's not something you see every day. It's just normal traffic. People come out for carnivals, and in Tripoli they keep the gold shops open until 8 or 9 at night, and there are Ferris wheels with children squealing on them until late. And it's this image that people in the wire service seem to want to build up of Libya as extremely violent and unstable and so forth is simply not true. They're in a transitional phase, and there are difficulties. Some of the worst violence that has occurred has been in these very small towns on the edge of the desert or deep in the south, like Sabha. The issue of whether there should have been a United Nations intervention or not, I think is a very abstract one at this point. It is rather like arguing that Netherlands actually won the World Cup. I mean, It's over with. And as international interventions go, it had a lot of virtues. There were no troops on the ground, despite what we were promised by the critics of the thing. There wasn't a neo-colonial state in the aftermath. In fact, nobody seems to have been able to predict what kind of a state would emerge, and the Libyans themselves were under no illusions as to what kind of state they wanted. They went to parliamentary elections as soon as it was feasible. They ran parties. I spoke to people who were running for parliament, including an unveiled woman who was headmistress of a school. The elections were relatively free and fair. The polling stations were only closed in about 8 neighborhoods throughout the country. Almost everybody got to vote. And so, you can make an argument, if you like, about intervention in Syria and how it might be different, or it's good or it's bad. But the tendency of Mr. Lavrov in Russia to say that we shouldn't do anything about what's happening in Syria because look at how badly Libya turned out is just wrong on the facts. Libya is doing just fine, thank you, and is doing much better than post-revolutionary France did in the 1790s. That was a real mess. But then with regard to, finally, this framing of the debate about Obama and Bush and so forth, Barack Obama did not want to go into Libya. Barack Obama campaigned in 2008 on getting out of Iraq, on non-intervention, on a return to kind of Bush 1 defensive realism. And the last thing he wanted was to be drawn into a military action in an Arab country. It was against everything that he had stood for. And Sean Kay, who was in the White House at the time, told me that as of March 19th, the word in the White House was that they weren't going to go in. This was not an intervention spearheaded by Barack Obama. It was spearheaded by, for reasons I don't entirely understand, Nicolas Sarkozy, David Cameron, and then it was spearheaded by Benghazi. It was spearheaded by the Libyans themselves, who drew the United States into this quite reluctantly. And the U.S. did fly some important missions in Libya and so forth, but Obama was criticized for leading from behind. I think it's the most unhelpful thing in the world to frame what happened in Libya as an imposition of American imperialism on a defenseless, poor third world country. That country was being destroyed by Muammar Gaddafi, who was frankly mentally unstable. And you go around Libya, and it is like rural Jordan. It's not like an oil state. I've been to oil states. They have nice new buildings and nice highways, and people have bathrooms. And Libya was reduced to the conditions of a fourth world society by that man, and he stole their money and he socked it away in Western banks, and then he sent some of it to places like Sierra Leone and so forth to make trouble and wars in Africa. So the idea that Gaddafi somehow represents national sovereignty and legitimacy and authenticity and shouldn't have been imposed upon by Obama is just it's the most unhelpful framing of this issue that we could find. So I think there are real moral and ethical and legal issues with regard to Syria going forward, largely because of the three-level disputes that Phyllis talked about and the opposition of China and Russia on the Security Council and so forth. But in Libya, the world will was that there should be an intervention to stop that man from sending in tanks to slaughter people in places like Misrata, and they were prevented from doing that to some extent by the NATO intervention, but mainly by the fighting Libyans' youth themselves. And I think anybody who values human life and democracy and those kinds of values ought to be very proud of what the Libyans have accomplished.
A final answer from Larbi on this question of democracy always being judged in Western terms or quoted that way. Thank you.
On democracy, I think really what I was really trying to hint at is maybe the possibility of living in a world where, well, at least like as far as the Arab Middle East is concerned, where Max Weber, Karl Marx, Montesquieu, Rousseau, Hegel, were absent what if all of these names were not there? What kind of polity would there be, in the Arab Middle East? Does that really mean they would not be able either to have some kind of imagining of how to go about, reconstruction of polity? Because there is really heritage, And really, I'm really saying this, I'm actually really getting into the nitty-gritty of the type of politics actually, we imagine or we're, functioning with. Because remember, for Arabs, politics, the notion of politics, tasyis, siyasa, comes from the grooming of horses, whereas politics, in the Arab, the Western imaginary is something, to do, with ships, sort of keeping an even keel, of a floating ship, in the sea, completely different, imaginary. That is really important, And if you go, I mean, sort of even if you go, for instance, to Al-Madinah al-Fadila, the virtuous city. Remember, sort of in Arabo-Islamic philosophy, there's no such term as freedom, and that's really why actually, I know Stephen, is correct, redistribution of power. But what is the term for power in Arabic? What is it? Sulta? What is it? Nufudh? That would be a neologism. You've got neologisms, and calques, linguistically speaking, but you don't really have actually an original term that captures, the essence, of power. Okay, remember, so render unto Caesar what Caesar, and render unto God what's God's. So it does not really have an analog at all, because the function of politics, or the image, the terrain is prismatic. These divisions, private, public, gods, men's, do not really exist. And I know sort of our friend, of course I'm aware of the young Hegel and all of the Hegels, sort of, but the thing really is that, when you say the proof of evidence, we had wars, we had fitna. The biggest imaginary in Islamic history is fitna. And that's really why probably for hundreds of years we had actually, unitary, solid, regimes, because of the fear of fitna, the fear of dissidence, the fear of a schism, in the body politic, literally, the anatomy of the Islamic state or the Muslim state, cannot afford, schisms at all. Whereas, when you talk democracy, that is the beauty of democracy, that you can actually have, dissidence, and you can have conflict, and you can have difference. That's why I said the representation of difference. Of course, I'm not really interested in the procedural side of it. Of course, you can have elections, but you can also end up with election fetishism. It's a fetish, to have an election. How do you redistribute power? It's this. So really, it's, and I think really the Farabian, the Ibn Hazm, Averroes, and this whole thing about naql aql, sort of, the rational and, the imitative, is really important, in the Islamic, imaginary. Of course, Al-Farabi say, look, it's harmonization. You've got to harmonize, and that's really why you've got this thaqafa, tawfiqiyya, a harmonizing, ethos. In the West, it's actually a pluralizing ethos. For us, it's to harmonize things, because the Greeks, gave you one type of happiness, eudaimonia. For us, there is two. The eudaimonic moment is actually is bifurcated. It's the here now and the hereafter. Sort of. It's really important, because you're not just it's not short-term. Politics in Islam is not short-term at all. It's not about the next election and the election after, and sort of the state. There is a transcendence. For you, transcendence, has been captured by the state. The state became or has become almost God. For us, we still have got really a God. Of course, I'm not really saying that that you don't believe or you don't. So really, I'm trying actually to tease you into thinking about, when you say the proof of evidence. Remember, Ghazali came in the middle of, the 13th century, and he said, well, sort of, it's a nur that's struck him, whatever, and, end of questions. It's not the Cartesian thing, doubt, You cannot have a doubt as a Muslim at all, because you've got this fixed, immutable source, of certainty, which is God. Okay, and that's really non-negotiable. That's non-questionable, but everything else you can question, as a Muslim. So when you say, like, the proof of evidence, sort of remember what we did with the people who spoke like you, the Mu'tazilites, we just like ditched them, to the proverbial dustbin of history. So we don't really want to listen to this. So the Ash'arites came and others, so it's really Al-Farabi, it's Ibn Hazm, it's Al-Ahkam al-Sultaniya, Al-Mawardi. I think these are really important texts, sort of. I've been teaching, Western, norms of politics and, political theory, democracy, democratization for a long, time. And that's really why when I, raised the question of democracy, I guess really I go with Claude Lefort, the absence of a logos, of a center. You don't really have like a fixed single center. You don't have like a single ideology. You don't have like a single caste that says, this is my power, this is like, my share of power. That's really why, I guess really people reacted, and unhinged, this caste, sort of. Sorry? Okay, cheers. Okay, there you go.